Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the United Nations and other groups doing to help promote information and distribute and disseminate information about war and peace, economic and social development, and human rights? My guest today is involved with a group that's very active on all three of these issues. My guest today is Mr. Bruce Knotts. Bruce Knotts is the chair of the Non-governmental organization, Department of Public Information Executive Committee at the United Nations. Bruce Knotts, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you.
I appreciate you being with me. We're going to get rid of that non-governmental organization part. We'll just do NGO DPI now, since we all have a ballpark idea of what it is. What is it? What exactly is this committee?
So, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, can be affiliated with the UN in several different ways, two of them being DPI and the other being ECOSOC, Department of Public
Economic
Information.
and Social Council.
Right.
Okay.
DPI-affiliated NGOs, and there are about 1,600 of them, help the United Nations disseminate its information around the world. So, and that's mainly what NGOs, I think, are here to do, is to work with the UN to expand the role that the UN has, because it can't do everything on its own.
Mm-hmm. And these non-governmental organizations play a critical role. And you've got service clubs like Rotary International, Lions International. You've got basically every major religious group in the world is affiliated in some way, shape, or form with the UN. You've got environmental groups, labor groups, business groups, just on across the board. And they have literally hundreds of millions of members, do they not?
Lots of networks and networks within networks, and that's why we are an asset to the Department of Public Information, because we're able to send out the information that the UN wants to get out to the world through all of our various networks.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that the Department of Public Information does every year, or almost every year, is to provide an annual meeting or a sort of an informational session called the NGO DPI Conference. And last year they had one, as I think you said, it was on education for global citizenship. What exactly was the thrust of that, and what were some of the outcomes of it?
Well, first of all, let me say that I think these conferences are, as I call them, percolators of new ideas. Mm-hmm. And we have demonstrated in the past, like the Rio Plus 20 conference basically led into the Paris Climate Accords. Various of our conferences in the past led to the Sustainable Development Goals. So our conferences bring up ideas which then feed into UN processes. So the conference we had in Korea was on education for global citizenship. And that second part is really important, because it's not just education. Everybody has some kind of education, but it's education to make people think about global issues like climate change, like war and peace, like sustainable development. And we think that's important. We also think it's important that we have inclusive education and that we educate for equality and that no one's left behind. And that's a phrase that's used all the time, but also ignored as much as it's used. And we want to make sure that when we say no one's left behind, really nobody's left behind. Mm-hmm.
And when we're talking about inclusive education, we're talking about education for all, everybody.
Especially
especially children, obviously.
Well, and the conference that we talked about, of course, we focused a lot on children, but education is a lifelong process.
Exactly.
And it shouldn't ever end. Mm-hmm. And everybody should have ongoing education always.
Mm-hmm. That is so very, very important. Yes, it is. The conference we were talking about, there was another conference or an action plan, Guangzhou Action Plan. Thank you.
I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it right either, but
well, we're both off, so it doesn't matter. Okay, please.
But it was actually a beautiful historic city. It used to be the imperial capital or of the kingdom of Korea back 1,000 years ago. Just a really fantastic place. And the action plan is all about this inclusive education for everybody so that everybody can think globally. And it's not in any way, shape, or form trying to make everybody the same. You know, heaven forbid, we wouldn't want everybody the same. That would be boring and terrible. But we want people in all of their differences, with all of their different religions and cultures and stuff, to be able to understand other cultures and other religions and truly be global citizens and think about this one planet, because we only have one planet. There's no planet B, and if we don't get this right on this planet, there really isn't any place for us to go. We don't have the technology to go to Mars yet, so this is it, and we've got to take good care of what we have.
You are so right. There is no planet B. I think former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said that a year or two ago, and he was right on target.
He was at the conference, and yes, I have taken his phrase, so I use it shamelessly.
Exactly. Well, this year the DPI NGO conference is going to be held in August. What will be the theme? You're still working it out, I'm sure, but what do you plan to talk about?
We are working it out, and the thinking at the moment is that it's going to be on refugees and migration. And we want it to be an intergenerational dialogue as well. The two largest growing demographics in the world are young people. About 50% of the world's population is below the age of 30. But the other demographic that's growing by leaps and bounds are older people, people like me. And the above 50, we're all living longer. I mean, it used to be people would die at 60. Nowadays, we're living to 80, 90, up into 100. And that demographic is a growing demographic as well. So we want to set up dialogues between these huge demographics of young people and older people and get them talking together, looking for solutions to the world's refugee and migration problems. And again, we want to play the role of a think tank, of an incubator that will then feed into UN processes. There will be a UN conference on migration and refugees in September of 2018. So we want to have a setup conference in 2017, perhaps another conference earlier in 2018 that will lead into the member state conference in September 2018.
Very good. Now, obviously you couldn't, there's no venue large enough to hold 100,000 people, but if people want to participate in this, would they contact their group? For example, Rotarians would contact Rotary. They get a certain number of slots to attend. The Sierra Club gets so many, the AFL-CIO, how does that work?
It is open registration.
It's
so
open registration.
Open registration.
Okay.
Anybody can attend. And in Guangzhou, South Korea, we had about 3,500, which is about normal for our conferences. Generally speaking, these are NGOs that are affiliated with the UN in some sort of way, so that's kind of an important criteria. But we do accept people to come to the conferences that are not part of the UN. We also webcast it. We've got this wonderful facility here that the UN has, and so people are able to watch these sessions, or at least some of them, at home, and they rest on UN Web TV, so you can watch them again and again and again, and hopefully they will, as I said, influence UN processes on the critical issues of migration and refugees. Just a bit more on that. To me, the bedrock issue of refugees and migration is climate change. Over on top of that, you have religious, political, and social conflicts, but at the bedrock is climate change, and that means we're going to have more refugees and more migrants, and we've got to get that right, and I don't think we have it right now. So we've got to come up with better solutions than what we have at the moment.
And you're absolutely right. If you look at so many of the problems around the world, you look at the conflicts that are taking place, you look at the refugees, many of them are climate change refugees. Many of the conflicts were started because of climate change problems. And of course we see the glaciers are melting, the deserts are expanding, the storms are becoming more violent, more frequent and more violent, and just on across the board, and the situation is deteriorating. And if we don't get climate change under control, or at least semi control, we've got a major problem.
And when a place no longer becomes tenable, and I say all of this climate change is basically to do with water. It's either not enough water or too much water. So in some places you have droughts, like in Syria, you had a 12-year drought, which is a bedrock reason why there's conflict in Syria. Again, there are other factors on top of that, but at the bedrock is climate change, is drought. In other areas like Bangladesh, there are rising sea levels and they're losing their coastline, and coastal communities then have to move. Whenever people move to a new area, there's a potential for conflict.
There certainly is, and you can see even today in countries like Bolivia, in the Altiplano, you've got the glaciers are disappearing, and you've got people living on the Altiplano. What are they going to do? They can't live without water. They're not going to pipe water up there. They're going to move. That's exactly what is going to happen, and that's just one example. Nepal is having some of the same problems, and that's a very mountainous, glacier-oriented region. But it is something that we just have to take more seriously. And of course, you mentioned the Paris Agreement. That is a good first start, but we're going to have to move a lot faster and a lot further, are we not?
And this is one of the reasons why the NGOs are in partnership with the United Nations, because again, it's a bigger issue than the United Nations can handle all by itself. And what we want NGOs doing as being basically lobbyists for their own governments, to make sure that their governments abide by the Paris Climate Accords and all the other accords that they sign here at the UN. Who's going to hold their feet to the fire? And we're hoping NGOs can play a role in that.
Now, in December of 2015, I guess it was, the UN General Assembly, the 193 members of the UN General Assembly signed off on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the Development Agenda for 2030. We won't go through all 17 goals, but how important are those goals, and what are a couple of them, and how do they tie into what you're doing?
Well, they're very important, and preceding the Sustainable Development Goals, we had 8 Millennium Development Goals, which called on the elimination of poverty and basic education and gender equality, and a lot of those really good goals. And the UN, together, coordinating the entire globe, reached up to the goals. I don't think any of the goals were absolutely 100% fulfilled, but having a goal and working towards it worked. Now, we didn't finish the job, so there needed to be a new set of goals. And civil society, again, the NGOs really pushed hard on a far more human rights agenda within the Sustainable Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals were very much about getting developing countries to develop. The Sustainable Development Goals are for everybody, developed and developing countries. We all have work that we need to do on gender equality, on sustainable development, on climate change issues, on eliminating poverty. Even a country like the United States, rich country, has poverty. So these are goals for all countries, not just the developing countries.
And these goals are very commendable in that they are, well, goal number 1 is to eliminate poverty, to eliminate hunger, to promote sustainable development, to empower women, and to do many other laudable things to improve the planet and to make the planet more habitable. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com and take a look at some of our previous shows. Also, if you have an interest in our programs and you're involved with any type of media outlet, be it a PBS station, community access television, or an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or maybe you just have a website and you'd like to share our programs, please feel free to download them. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge, at no cost, as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives, certainly, if not today, tomorrow. Today we're taking a look at many of the non-governmental organizations that are involved at the United Nations and what the UN is doing to help disseminate information about peace and security, to talk about war and peace, to talk about economic and social development, as well as human rights. And my guest today is an expert on all these issues. My guest today is Mr. Bruce Knotts. Mr. Knotts is the chair of the Non-Governmental Organization Department for Public Information Executive Committee, DPI NGO Executive Committee. Bruce, we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals and how important they are. And one thing before we get off of them, you mentioned all these other NGOs. So all these NGOs up here at the UN have, like we said before, hundreds of millions of members, and all of them helped or were involved in some of the 8 Millennium Development Goals, and all of them are involved in some or all of the Sustainable Development Goals. The key, I think, that the challenge that these groups have is to get the word down to their membership to help them be apprised that they need to be involved, because it is a unified effort. We all have to participate together, and that is a real challenge. So often the upper leadership knows what's happening, but maybe the folks down at the grassroots level, if we can use that term again, are not sure, what the Sustainable Development Goals are. Do you talk to your members about that?
We talk about it a lot, and it's
Okay.
very important that everybody knows what these goals are and what the targets are and how we're going to reach these goals. The Millennium Development Goals probably took about 10 years to be in force before most people even knew they existed. And the entire period of the goals was only 15 years, so 10 years was just getting people to find out. the rollout of the Sustainable Development Goals has been much better. And I think we've penetrated people's consciousness on the Sustainable Development Goals much better than we did with the Millennium Development Goals. And that's been a large part, the NGOs expanding the efforts of the UN. The other thing that actually I had suggested, and it's been taken up by a lot of people, is to come up with a better name for the Sustainable Development Goals, because that's a bit of a mouthful.
Snazzier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you will see on a lot of billboards and on a lot of websites the global goals. And global goals, for one thing, is just easier to say, and for some people that's just an easier concept to deal with. And so no matter how you want to term it, whatever you want to call it, people are finding out and should find out about these goals and be part of the solution. We have a tendency to sometimes think, okay, the UN is going to do it, or our government is going to do it, or, you know, and the fact of the matter is governments and the UN can't do everything.
Exactly.
Aza Khan, who's probably been a guest on your show, if she hasn't been yet, you need
Not
to
yet,
get
but
her.
she will be.
She is the UN's liaison with the faith community. And she has said, and I trust her word, is that something like 80% of humanitarian assistance in the world is done by faith-based organizations. And that just shows you that a lot of the work that's being done to help children, to help people that are hungry, to help with disaster assistance, is being done by NGOs, either faith-based or secular NGOs. And it's not necessarily coming from governments. And the funding is not necessarily coming from governments or the UN. The funding comes from foundations, private individuals. That's the network that we represent. And that's why we feel we're important partners with the UN on all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Well, we could spend the rest of the show on that, but before we run out of time, I want to get into a topic. You mentioned you had just returned from Vietnam. We didn't have a chance to get into a great discussion on that, and you addressed the United States Embassy in Hanoi.
I did.
On the Think Equal campaign, is that correct, or was it on some other topic? You tell me. Tell us.
Think Equal is a campaign. Leslie Udwin is the founder and CEO of this campaign. She's got support from Meryl Streep, so she's got an A-list group of people that are working with her. And she wants to end the, you know, you begin to learn bigotry really very early in life, about age 3, it's sometimes estimated. So the curriculum actually starts at age 3. And it teaches children from the age of 3 to think equal. Men and women are equal. Black and white are equal. Gay and straight are equal. Whatever you're talking about, we are all equal. There is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that says we are all born free and equal in dignity and rights. So this curriculum is designed to teach that from a very early age, actually from the age of 3 all the way through high school. So Leslie has gotten, the government of Sri Lanka has adopted this as part of their curriculum. Botswana and Kenya have adopted this. Some 2,000 schools around the world have adopted this, and we were in Vietnam to get them to adopt it. So we were there with the folks from the Ministry of Education and the public and universities, and we pitched this curriculum to get people to think about adopting a curriculum, because we in our schools we do a lot of education for the mind. We don't do much education for the heart, and that's critical as well.
And if our viewers would like, they can go to www.thinkequal.com and get more information on this particular topic. You mentioned discrimination, biases, stereotypes, that type of thing. And one group, the LGBTQ, or however you want to put it, community, is one that has certainly suffered a tremendous amount of discrimination over the past several years. That is a group that has seen increased visibility at the United Nations. I know many of the countries at I won't say all, certainly not all, but many of the countries at the UN do have some very severe, stringent sanctions against people who are part of the LGBTQ community. What has happened at the UN to raise visibility and to eliminate these really, I want to say, disastrous impressions of people and not extend the full human rights to them? But the UN I remember Ban Ki-moon has tried to turn that around when he was Secretary General. He's the former Secretary General. But what has happened at the UN, and what is happening?
Well, I'd say I happened to the UN.
Okay.
I actually came here in 2008, And the first thing I did was I was on a planning committee for the DPI NGO conference in Paris on human rights to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And as we were planning here at the UN for that, everybody talked about every human right you could possibly think of. Dalit people in India, Roma people in Europe. And I started raising my hand and I said, what about LGBT people? And they said, oh, we'll take that under advisement. And meeting after meeting, up would go my hand, and I kept saying, what about LGBT people? And people started coming to me, because this is a good place. The UN is a really good place with really good people. And they started coming in to help me. They said, okay, we'll promote this, we'll help you, we'll make sure that LGBT rights get on the agenda of this DPI NGO conference in Paris in 2008. So France was, of course, the host country for that. It announced at this conference that it would table a resolution or present a resolution or a draft resolution at the UN that year, because it was in its capacity as President of the European Union. So December 18th, just 8 days after Human Rights Day here at the UN, it presented a draft resolution which was signed by 66 countries, calling on the world to end discrimination and violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity. That moved forward into 2009. We kept the lobbying effort. Ban Ki-moon gave his first speech on this issue on December 10th, 2010. What really hurt me was there was crickets from the press. No comment at all from the press. 1 full year later, Hillary Clinton said gay rights are human rights, December 10th, 2011, covered all over the press. And it was almost as if she thought of it, and she didn't think of it. The idea percolated, as I said, here at the United Nations. Ban Ki-moon gave his first speech a full year before Hillary Clinton did. Unfortunately, the press did not pick that up. And it's something that bothers me all the time. I'm glad you're doing what you're doing, but the media really needs to pay more attention to what happens here at the UN. And it's just been, I would say, victory after victory until I would say about 2012, 13, 14. We were getting some pushback on this. There are countries that feel this offends their culture and their values, and so there's a real contest. I would say the majority of countries are either in favor or leaning to favor equal rights for people regardless of their sexual orientation and gender identity. And that's the acronym that we use here at the UN, which is SOGI, S-O-G-I, for sexual orientation, gender identity, which means you don't need the alphabet soup of LGBTQI, XYZ, and all that other stuff. So we just say SOGI, S-O-G-I.
Just say SOGI.
Yes.
That's all you need, yes.
Yeah.
Well, in the last minute or so we have, what do you see as your major challenge in helping to get the message, the full message of the topics that we're talking about today, the issues, out to the public and to help people better understand them?
I think, I mean, when the United Nations was formed, everybody looked to this institution with great hope and expectation. It's not seen so favorably in some parts of the world, and I think that's truly unfortunate, because I do believe the United Nations is our last best hope for peace, for human rights, for sustainable development, for keeping this one planet sustainable and safe for all of us, because we don't have a planet B. And so I'm hoping that NGOs can be part of getting that message out, that the UN is vital to all of us. We have a nationalistic trend going on at the moment, which kind of stifles the effort for global engagement. And the United Nations stands tall for global engagement on global issues that affect us all.
And we do need to learn about the Security Council peace. We also need to learn about the issues you've talked about today, the climate change, LGBT issues. Talk about the other parts of the UN that help move aircraft, ships, mail, weather information around the world. Services are absolutely vital to people in the United States and worldwide. And hopefully the media will, which sometimes do a very good job on the Security Council, but kind of forget that other 80% and start refocusing on some of the other UN institutions or agencies within the UN. Bruce Knox, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and very informative program.
Thank you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.